Democratic colleague Chris Coons to vote present to advance Mike Pompeo's Secretary of State nomination yesterday. And Senator Coons joins us now. And for those who might not get the politics of this, who thought maybe you should have stuck to your guns, tell us why you did that.
Well, Mika, I really appreciate what Chairman Corker had to say afterwards. To be clear, I voted against Mike Pompeo in the committee and will vote against him on the floor. But because of a Senate rule, he couldn't advance from the committee to consideration by the full Senate unless a majority of senators present voted that way. And my good friend Johnny Isakson had been at home in Georgia delivering a eulogy for his best friend that afternoon. The only thing that changing my vote to present did was change the hour of the vote. If I hadn't done that, Senator Isakson would have been compelled to come to Washington last night. He could have gotten in about 11:30, and we would have reconvened, and he would have had to cast the same vote. So it didn't change the outcome, but it did change the timing. And it was an opportunity for me to show a small measure of kindness and respect to a colleague in the Senate.
Joe.
So, Senator, let me ask you about your vote against Mike Pompeo. I certainly can understand Democrats not feeling gracious towards a Republican majority that wouldn't even talk to Merrick Garland. It was a shameful exercise. Speaking of a lack of comedy in the Senate, it was absolutely shameful and will be marked in the history books as such. But if you look at this situation, let's just talk about the merits. You have in Mike Pompeo, obviously somebody who's bright, educated, the best and the brightest. He served his country. He's been an elected official, so you know he's not a radical that hasn't had to face voters. He certainly is within the mainstream of Republican orthodoxy in 2018. Those same Republicans who were elected to control the Senate, elected to control the House, elected to control the White House. You have America's commander-in-chief saying that he needs Mike Pompeo as his Secretary of State. And by the way, a guy who would be far more connected, apparently, to Donald Trump than Rex Tillerson ever was, and I would even argue than John Kerry at times was connected to Barack Obama. So why would you vote against Mike Pompeo?
Well, Joe, I think like all of my Democratic colleagues on the committee, my vote was mostly driven by things Mike Pompeo said and did as a candidate for Congress and as a congressman in his conduct in the Benghazi hearings, in statements he's made about regime change, and in belligerent past statements he's made, and in particular some statements he'd made about Muslim Americans and about the LGBT community. But I agree with a number of the things you said, Joe, that a Secretary of State has to speak for the president, should be someone who really advocates for the career professionals in the State Department, and should be in the room with the president, able to really advocate for diplomacy. Those are things that Rex Tillerson, because of the bad chemistry he had with the president and his real lack of connection to the State Department, wasn't successful at. At the end of the day, my core concern was about whether or not Mike Pompeo will advocate for rule of law, for human rights, for democracy, for our core values, or will principally be focused on using military force and on security concerns. There's no doubt that he is smart and skilled and understands how Washington works. And I am hopeful he'll be a successful Secretary of State. But at the end of the day, he was not someone I could support. There are other Republicans I would gladly support, like Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Bob Corker.
All right.
Well, you talked about how things that he had said during his campaigns. I think he made several clarifying statements before the committee. But though I disagreed with some of the things that he did say that Democrats had concerns with, as you know very well, all the world's a stage. And when you're running for office in Kansas, you're taking on one role. But if you wanted a better idea of how he would carry himself, you could look to his service at the CIA. And all reports I've heard, at least from the rank and file there, is that he did a good job there. He built morale at that institution. It's a tough place to work. Shouldn't he be judged by what he did at the CIA and whether he could transfer those skills over to the State Department?
Well, Joe, I think the majority in the committee voted based on their hope about how he will behave as Secretary of State, based on just those factors, how he led the CIA. I think my concerns were about his long record of associating himself with and speaking on issues of values in ways that really don't reflect the best of American values. And frankly, more of my problems were with President Trump and his conduct of foreign policy. It is encouraging to see that rather than tweets about fire and fury, we are seeing a genuine diplomatic opening to North Korea. There's a long way to go to actually accomplish denuclearization and to get Kim Jong-un and North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons. But Mike Pompeo and hopefully President Trump seem to be making real progress in negotiating rather than threatening imminent attack on North Korea. That's a positive. There are many vacancies at the State Department and in our ambassadorial posts around the world, and I hope to have a chance to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in the committee to move some of those folks forward. Most of these don't have nominations from the administration. For the South Korean ambassador, for example, or the assistant secretary for the region for East Asia Pacific. There's other things we have to be working on together. And I'll remind you that this week, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, is in town. There will be a state dinner tonight. There will be an address to Congress tomorrow. And what he's pressing is for President Trump not to pull us out of the Iran deal. He sees clearly the threat that Iran presents to the region, to Syria, with its ballistic missile program, its human rights violations. But my hope is that we won't pull out of that agreement. And I wasn't convinced that Mike Pompeo sees Iran, sees Syria, and sees that agreement the same way I do. And at the end of the day, I hope to be proven wrong. I hope that Mike Pompeo will end up being a Secretary of State who does lead with our values and who does promote partnership with our allies.
Willie.
Senator Coons, it's Willie Geist. If you look at previous votes, confirmation votes for Secretaries of State, Tillerson only received 56. But if you go back before Trump, both John Kerry and Hillary Clinton received 94 votes in the Senate. Condi Rice received 85 votes in the Senate. There are a lot of people who look at this confirmation and at Tillerson's as well process and say Democrats are sending a message to Donald Trump that this is about President Trump and not the man who's being nominated for the position. What do you say to that criticism that you want to knock on President Trump and that this isn't really about what kind of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo would be?
Well, I'll say there are other Republican leaders in foreign policy who could have been nominated, who I think would have gotten 75 or 80 votes fairly easily. Stephen Hadley, for example, Nikki Haley. I mentioned Bob Corker and others. I do think that Rex Tillerson, given his long and close association with Putin and with Russia and his leadership of ExxonMobil, and the circumstances of the timing of his confirmation vote, faced a number of headwinds. And I think Mike Pompeo, given some of his past statements we've already covered, faced some headwinds. But more broadly, Willie, you're right that there is some broad concern in the Senate, not just among Democrats, about President Trump's conduct of foreign policy. As a candidate, he promised to be unpredictable and untraditional, and he has certainly overperformed in that category. I'll remind you, with regards to Syria, we went with a president who a few weeks ago was tweeting, "It's time for us to pull out American troops," to a president who carried out a military attack against Assad's regime. Big swings like that on major issues, from North Korea to Syria to Iran to Russia, have happened just in the past year. And I think that has unsettled many of us on the Foreign Relations Committee and given us real concern.
Senator Chris Coons, thank you so much for being on the show this morning.
Thank you.
Good to see you. And still ahead, can a national security advisor retain his integrity if the